Chapter 2. Curves. Next morning, Gio was woken from his bed at 6 o'clock by the loud clanging of a pan from the kitchen. Gio slowly crawled from his bed and shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes open. Ernesto was already sat at the table. Gio sat down and they ate a breakfast of bread and fruit in silence. Together they left the cottage and began to walk to the main house. Gio followed his father sulkily. He could feel the anger building up inside him again like a furnace. It was going to explode inside him. He became very hot and felt like screaming. It was not fair, he thought over and over again. Just not fair. Occasionally, the savagery of this internal tempest gathered enough energy to burst out of him, and he would run and kick up a scuff of dust, or pick up a large stone and throw it violently towards a lemon on a tree, whilst letting out a wordless curse. Ernesto heard all the fussing and ignored him and continued to walk the few miles up the hill to work. On a small, dusty, single-lane track, a muscular silver car was moving at speed through the winding corners. It darted from one side to another like a gray wolf chasing down prey as it slid sideways through the snaking bends. Huge plumes of dust clouded up behind it. The engine roared, then popped and banged as it changed gears. The car had two chromed exhaust pipes emerging along the sides from behind the spoked front wheels. They ran alongside the car underneath the doors like two fat cigars before turning outwards just before the rear wheels. Licks of flame darted from them intermittently. The front of the car had two small circular headlights and a large oval grille like the flat snout of a gigantic wild boar. In the center of the grille was the famous silver five-pointed star logo of the Mistral Motor Company. This was a Mistral M6. This particular M6 was made in Bologna for Sergio Rossi by one of Italy's most famous racing car manufacturers. Upon the passenger seat lay an oily brown envelope stuffed with piles of crumpled lira, and upon that a single white rose. Behind the fine, brass-studded wooden steering wheel, Sergio Rossi lit a cigarette and hung it on his lip. The car drifted sideways through a long, sweeping bend as he exhaled the soft, velvety brown smoke. His huge grin turned sharply into a scowl. An old peasant woman and a donkey laden with baskets was crossing the track in the distance. He began to press down repeatedly on the horn. The donkey bucked high and shot into the groves, braying and snorting. The baskets bounced and 100 lemons exploded high into the air. The old woman snarled and shook her fist at Sergio as he scorched past her, leaving her and the donkey in a cloud of fine beige dust. Freshly crushed lemons covered the track and clung to the tires of the Mistral M6. The tires spat them out onto the fat, searing hot chromium exhausts where they stuck and sizzled. Sergio noted the smell of burnt lemon and chuckled to himself. Ernesto and Gio had heard the distant horn above the terrifying, unearthly roar. The deafening shotgun blasts announced the approaching car. They quickly stepped off the track into the short, arid grass. The mechanical gray wolf burst into view with a violent snarl as it eyed up its next prey. They could see the menacing snout and the silver star in the grille targeting them like the scope of a sniper's rifle. Ernesto recognized the grinning face behind the windshield as the car blazed towards and then past them, horn blaring out a single long, solid tone. In a few moments it was racing away from them, and the dust smothered and settled on them, then cleared slowly. Gio laughed at his father holding a handkerchief to his mouth and coughing. Ernesto frowned and began to wave the dust from the air and then to pat it out of his clothes. The silver car slid around a distant corner and out of sight. Slowly the noise faded and the dust settled. The sun still shone and the sky was once again clear and crystal blue. When they arrived at the house, Ernesto took Gio to the barns where the cars were kept and pointed towards the first of 5 arched barn doors. The long, stone-built barns extended like a pair of arms from the rear of the house, embracing a very large gravel courtyard. The silver Mistral M6 sat majestically outside the barn. Gio could see waves of heat shimmering above the bonnet. He marveled at how proud and fierce it looked. It was nothing like the other cars in the town. "Just you behave yourself today, Gio. If you play up with Bernardo, we could both be out of a job and a home, and you'll be gutting tuna for the rest of the holidays. There'll be no daily visits to your mother's grave then," said Ernesto, who had finally had enough of Gio's petulance and used the hard words on him. Gio scowled angrily for a moment at the indignity his father had laid upon him, then looked down at his sandaled feet and legs in his little brown shorts and held his silence. He looked up and around. Seeing the grand house, the barns, and this monstrous automobile cracking and fuming in the sun as it cooled down, he suddenly realized he was still very much a child in a man's world. "I'm sorry," said Gio quietly. Ernesto smiled and ruffled his hair fondly. "I'll see you for lunch in the main house. Elsa will be cooking something wonderful for you. You know how much she adores you," said Ernesto. Gio's eyes opened wide as he thought of Elsa, whom he liked very much, and then thought of her daughter, who he liked even more. She was one of the pretty girls he'd started to notice. The thought of eating at the big table with all the other staff was comforting, and it distracted him from being angry. "Ciao," said Gio. "Learn to enjoy it, Gio," said Ernesto. "It's the only way." Gio shrugged his shoulders and walked to the first of the barn doors and found it unlocked. He had to struggle for a moment to stop himself from kicking the door open, but after a brief reflection he shook his head and simply opened the door and slipped inside. Ernesto removed his cap and looked up at the scorching sun in the clear blue sky. He wiped his dusty handkerchief across his sweaty scalp, fixed his cap, and headed off towards the tool shed to begin the day's work. It took about 20 seconds for Gio's eyes to adjust to the darkness inside the barn. The long, cavernous barn stretched into hazy black. It smelt of petrol, oil, creosote, and soil. He realized he actually liked the smell. It was unlike any other. Even so, his anger didn't entirely leave him. Half a dozen large, shadowy outlines blocked his way. Each of the shapes was punctuated by fingers of dusty white light poking through slits in the doors and roof. A small, plain, yellow light bulb hung on a long, brown, two-core twisted wire from the exposed beams at the far end of the barn. He could see the backs of two men hunched over a workbench. He recognized one of them as Bernardo. The workbench was scattered with bits of black, dirty metal, various tools, and small stacks of wooden boxes filled with even more dirty tools, wrenches, spanners, hammers, and all sorts of metal objects Gio had never seen before. Gio didn't recognize the other man. They were talking loudly and waving their arms. It was almost arguing, but not exactly. It was like the slightly drunken men he had seen in the bars in the town's local piazzas, excitable and rowdy, but harmless, even happy. This wasn't like the fights men and women have. It was somehow not as mean. The stranger held up a lump of awkwardly shaped silvery metal towards the light bulb. On the bench in front of them sat a huge silvery engine, partly shrouded in shadow. Gio squeezed past a dirty oil drum and made his way towards the men, passing a number of dark tarpaulin-covered car-sized shapes that he presumed would be the stupid cars he was going to have to clean. The thought of cleaning when he should be swimming made the anger well up inside of him again. This was the last place he wanted to be.